Okay, so everybody, thank you for showing up. It's 3 p.m. and we've got an expert here, Kim Daniels, that's going to be giving us a very interesting presentation. I hope that you'll enjoy it. My name is Brian Favela. I currently work for Toro in the Ag division, pretty large company, but I'm a senior buyer planner there. And for ASCM and the San Diego chapter, I'm a VP of administration. So kind of helping out with the hosting duties today, and Kim's gonna share her expertise with us. I hope that you'll enjoy it, and definitely want to give a shout out to everyone that joined up from the multiple areas that we advertised for from what we call the West Coast Collective. We're trying to combine efforts, skills, resources, pool whatever we can to strengthen our supply chain knowledge across the Western Canada chapter, um, the ASCM Seattle, Oregon, San Fernando Valley, and San Diego areas. So we're getting more people joining up, wanting to participate, and we're really excited that we had so many people wanting to attend. So thank you again for participating. And Kim, without further ado, please enlighten us and share what you have to say. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate the invite to speak to everybody today about supply chain and trade compliance and all the complications that is happening in these recent years. My name is Kim Daniels. I am a licensed customs broker and the owner of a customs brokerage house located just outside of Las Vegas, Nevada. I am also a licensed CLTD. I'm a trainer, and I am the president of the ASCM Forum for Southern Nevada. So let's go ahead and get started, because I know that, everybody has got lots of questions, and I encourage you guys, if you have questions, just go ahead and bring them up during the presentation. Don't wait until the end. This helps us to be more fully engaged in the conversation and to make sure that we're addressing everything that everybody is wondering about. So let's go ahead and get started. Whoops, all right, hit a button. There we go. So the questions really come down to, what do you know about your supply chain? How do you verify the compliance in the sectors, modes, and directions of your supply chain? What are the benefits of a compliant supply chain? What are the repercussions of a non-compliant supply chain? How do you prove the supply chain is trade compliant? And the other trade compliance issues that should be worried about. And then we'll go into questions. This is the only slide I will read verbatim. The rest of them, I'm going to show them, and then I'm going to talk specifically about what we're worried about. So you have many tiers in your supply chain. It really doesn't matter what you're importing. You may have direct contact with your supplier, but you also have your people who are moving your goods for you. You have your brokers that are in between, your middlemen. And what you need to know and ask yourself is, how many tiers are really in my supply chain? How many different organizations touch my stuff? And all of this actually affects you. So if your suppliers are transparent with their supply chains, then you're going to have a better situation when things come to a head, if there's anything to happen later. So you kind of got to say, hey, if I called my supplier and I said, I want to know who your supplier is, it's very unlikely, depending on the size of your business, they're going to tell you, because they don't want you going around them, right? But you do need to say, look, we have these rules that we have to comply with, and we want to make sure that you can validate that your supplier is in compliance with that, because the legal part of this, especially with some of the new laws that have come about, is that every part, every piece of that product you're importing or exporting is controlled. And so that's something that you need to be aware of. The receiving countries as well, if you're exporting your goods, what are the rules of your receiving countries? What are the rules of the US when you're exporting goods on countries that you can and cannot do business with? So it's really important to know who's getting your product, not just who you're selling it to, but who is that final person going to receive it. And that can be very, very difficult as well. So it's usually a lot of paperwork, a lot of legalese that you put into that system to make sure that you're doing everything that you can to show that you are within reason, able to say, no, I know I am compliant with the rules, and I did everything I could to make sure that my network is also compliant with the rules. Another problem that we have is that proving a negative can be very difficult. You have to prove you did not use something, right? So that can be very hard. And you can ask any attorney in the world and they'll tell you, yes, it's very difficult to prove you didn't do something. So that's where you really need to make sure that you have a good handle on your supply chain, that these compliance rules aren't going to come back and bite you later because your supply chain guidance and your supply chain watching and all the things that you have to do are somehow not very organized. And if the more organized you are, the better off you're going to be. So how to verify compliance? Forced labor is the big problem of the day. And so that's something that everyone is really, really concerned about. You can go to Google and actually input 11 ILO indicators. So these are the International Labor Organization indicators of forced labor. And you're going to want to find out what those indicators are. So when you're scoping out your new supplier, if you're getting a new one, or you're asking your current supplier, hey, we need to be in compliance with this, you are doing what you can. You may not be getting accurate information. It might even feel like a waste of time. But if you are putting in a system in your company stating specifically, we follow this, we know what these rules are, we are doing everything that we can control, because we can only control ourselves. So we are doing everything that we can control to make sure that this is right. Now, in the case of UFLPA, now, International Labor Organization is different. That's, forced labor. That is something that everyone is concerned about, and it's all over the world. UFLPA, Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, is concerned about goods coming out of the Xinjiang autonomous region in China. And so that's something that you have to be worried about, because that is right now it's considered arguably a genocide against the Uyghur Muslim people on that side of China. And that is something that we are getting involved in and saying, hey, you know what? We don't want to support the way that that particular community is doing their business. So no goods from that Xinjiang region are going to be allowed into the United States. And if you are bringing goods into the United States from that region, that's where you have to prove that negative, that whoever it is that you're buying from in that region is not using forced labor. And that's where it gets really sticky. We have a sanctions and embargo list that we have to be aware of. It has doubled in the time that I've been a broker. It was for the longest time just North Korea and Cuba. Now it is North Korea, Cuba, Russia, and Belarus. So these are things that you need to be aware of, is that no one within your supply chain that is receiving your goods are in those countries either, unless there is an exemption for it. Deemed exports. These are fun. These are your non-tangibles. These are your technology, your software. So for example, I won't use any names, but there is a drone company that operates in both China and the United States, and they have been known to sell their products to Russia from their China company. Well, now they're on the they're on the entity list, that we can't export goods to them. But they also have a company here in the United States. So, I think it would be very difficult for them to prove that they are not sending their engineering and their technology specs and things like that to their sister company in China. So that's something to be aware of, is that deemed exports are those intangible products that could be sent over, or training or anything like that, to a country that is sanctioned, or a person that is sanctioned. You also have your denied persons list, your entity list, and who your end user is. So these things need to be known. If you already have a customs broker, have a conversation with them. Say, hey, can you give me, we are doing business in this particular region. Can you give me a denied persons list for that particular country, just to make sure that we're not having to worry about getting in trouble later, or who's on that entity list. If you're doing business with a company on an entity list, for exports, they can't receive your goods. So, or you're not supposed to send it to them, or you could be fined or penalized. And the next one, Bureau of Industry and Security, they're the ones to really talk to. And let me stress this, I can't stress it enough. most of the people that I talk to at the government sectors are there to help you. You're tax-paying money. I mean, you're paying them. So they are there to help you, and they want to make sure that you're in compliance as well. They don't do any good if they're trying to trip you up. They're not trying to trip you up. They want to help you. But the best thing that you can do is go to them before things get bad. Go to them first. Okay, so when your supply chain is compliant, then you get a certain number of benefits from it. If you're a CTPAT member, which you can join, and there's some stipulations that come about from it, but it is a volunteer program. You can actually get, priority consideration, you can get, eligibilities, you can get some, shorter clearances. So it's logistically, it's still a little difficult, but there are things that you can do just because you're a CTPAT member. But by having a compliant supply chain, you can continue to prove this, and then you can become a CTPAT member if you don't want to. Whenever you end up finding yourself at the wrong end of a withhold release order, you can show that, hey, here's everything that we have done. We know we're compliant. We don't have any qualms about the people that we're doing business with. If any one of them are not compliant, then you can tell customs, hey, I did not know. And while they may not allow entry of your goods into the United States, they're less likely to give you a significant fine because you did everything that you were supposed to. And if anybody ever has a problem with that, there are plenty of attorneys that I meet almost every month that can help you with that. And really, it comes down to showing customs that you've done everything that you can, that you are organized, and that you have all of your information, all of your ducks in a row, and everything there is something that's going to be super helpful for you when they go and they say, hey, what's going on with this? Because you were super compliant. So, repercussions of a non-compliant supply chain. The withhold release order. This is very frustrating. Right now, according to my sources, withhold release orders are taking up about 13 million square feet of foreign trade zone warehouse space in Southern California. That's a lot of square footage. And the big thing is that, people don't know. They don't know what they don't know, and they don't ask. And you got to ask the questions, even if it seems like a dumb question. You have to ask the question of, hey, are we somehow non-compliant? So you have to prove you're negative. If you end up on a withhold release order, you have to say, hey, you know what? We did everything that we could. We believe that there's nothing wrong with our product. Here's all the paperwork, and you're very cooperative with customs. If customs agrees that maybe you are compliant, they then have to take that basically exception to Congress and get Congress to approve your import. And that can be rather difficult and take quite a long time. So it's very important that you have your information all organized, and that you have everything that you need in that one place, saying, look, we do not believe at any point that we have used any kind of forced labor or any other non-compliant activities. What makes you think that we did? And you're not really going to get an answer from them, but at least you can prove that, hey, there's some things that you've done, and that you've been very cautious about who you're doing business with, and not only who you're doing business with directly, but you're talking to them about who they're doing business with. Now, if you can't prove or you can't provide the paperwork, you're going to get denied. So this means two things. Your goods could be destroyed, or your goods could be exported. And if they're going to be exported, it's not going to go to a free trade country. So, you can take out anybody that's got a free trade agreement with the United States is also not supposed to accept those products that were possibly made with forced labor, or any other non-compliant issue, or any USMCA country. So forget Mexico and Canada. So it really, you'd have to take it to, Brazil, or, a country or Bahamas maybe, that we don't have a free trade agreement with, and say, hey, you know what? we have to put this over here for a bit because we're being denied entry, and then figure it out from there. And let me tell you what, that's a headache. It really is much better and much easier to be organized with your supply chain information. So thing about UFLPA, and this is where it gets a little bit cranky, especially for many of us who are trying to figure out how to qualify the information that we have, is that customs is taking a presumption of guilt. And on a cultural level, Americans aren't really cool with that, you know? So we're just saying, hey, really? Presumption of guilt. And here we are just, you know, doing our best, and we're just trying to run our companies. And especially if you work with teeny tiny companies like I do, you know, you just don't really understand why our government would take this presumption of guilt, and they don't care that it costs you so much more to import from somewhere else, or to have someone who can actually keep your supply chain information organized. They just say, hey, you know what? If your goods are made in whole or in part with forced labor, you are wrong. And that's pretty much it. I mean, that's it. It could be a button on a shirt. It could be the thread. It could be commingling. So commingling is one of those things that gets really complicated. So I spent a little bit of time on this. Cotton t-shirts, for example. Cotton comes from all kinds of places around the world, the United States, China, I believe Turkey has a cotton industry, and they all go to one place, and that one place will basically put all of these cotton pieces, and, you know, however they weave the cotton, and they'll commingle it. And so you can't really say that you can pull out the cotton from the shirts, because then you only have half a shirt left. So that won't be wearable. So we really have a problem with the way that they've phrased this law, in whole or in part, because you don't know. I mean, the buyer in the United States does not know if their cotton t-shirts that they imported from Bangladesh are commingled with cotton from the Xinjiang region. You just don't know. And there's no way to know. So that's where it gets really complicated. And that's where you've got to have some real heart-to-heart conversations with your suppliers and say, look, I know you can't tell me who you buy from, but I need you to verify that your cotton is not coming from Xinjiang. That's really the best thing that we've been able to do so far. And if you can get a legal statement, you know, written in, you know, preferably their country, so it actually holds any water, to say, hey, we agree, and we are not using, you know, these particular products in our apparel, right? Right now for the XUAR region, the United States is focused on tomatoes, cotton apparel, and polysilicon. And I think they just started another one, but I can't remember what it was, but they just added another one to the list. I want to say it's PVC. Yeah, I think it's PVC. So, you know, that's something to be aware of, that if you are importing plumbing products, stuff made with PVC, you know, you might want to know where they're coming from, because it's something that customs is looking very, very stringently at. Tomatoes, you would probably be surprised that, you know, tomato ketchup, actually, the tomatoes come from Xinjiang in many of the brands. I'm not going to name brands, but there are brands that bring in the tomatoes from Xinjiang using forced labor. And so they don't know it. And usually, you know, again, it's so many tiers down, they have no clue. But that is something that you've got to be able to figure out how you're going to ask your supply chain, okay, verify the origin of your tomatoes. So. All right, so let's go a little bit into non-compliance and what that looks like. Fines, penalties, and forfeitures, FP&F, usually on the import side. Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, usually on the export side. So BIS has a tendency to put penalties on people or companies who are not exactly doing things like they were. This most recent article is of last month, shows that there was a settlement agreement of a penalty of $2.7 million on 3D Systems Corporation. So that is really, really bad. I don't know about you. I don't have $2.7 million lying around. And it really is something that, you know, you've got to know who you're sending to. You can also look these up. I believe this is on the BIS website, and find out what the specifics of that particular. I want to know the real story. You know, there's stuff you read in the media, there's stuff you read that's put out there by the government, but you want to find out the real story of what's, you know, what exactly has happened and why this has happened to them. For example, FLIR Systems a few years back got a huge fine of $30 million because they violated FLIR, or violated the export laws of the United States. Now, I read the media said that, hey, you know what, we have, you know, we had this guy and he was doing his job and then he left the company, and they didn't say why he left the company, and they couldn't replace him. And then I found out at a conference that no, they replaced him, but the person they replaced him with was trying to do it all by herself and didn't delegate. And so it ended up getting out of control. And because of the volume and the nature of their business, it just got really, really bad. So that's something to be very aware of, is that you've got to have an organized system, and you got to check on the people who are working in that system to make sure that their bandwidth isn't overloaded and that they have people who are helping them to stay organized, having people who are helping them to keep everything compliant. Because it depending on the size of your company, it takes more than one person. You know, sometimes it can take an entire team of people to make sure your compliance is on point. Another problem that we're having is that companies in the United States have gone and they have, you know, advertised that, hey, we don't use forced labor. We're doing everything like we're supposed to. And then they have to apologize to China because they said they're doing everything they're supposed to by the United States. So it becomes kind of this balancing act in that, hey, you know what? Oh yeah, we have to tell our government that everything is fine. And then China gets mad because, hey, we're not using forced labor because in their culture, they don't consider it that. So compliance is a little bit of politics, which is kind of annoying. Then you have other things like the first sale rule. So you get penalties, and this is for importing. You get penalties for improper use of the first sale rule, because sometimes what this can do is that first sale can actually reduce your duty requirement or your duty obligation, because it lowers it a little bit. I don't personally have any companies in my client base that are using the first sale rule, except unless they're in tobacco because they're required to. But you know, some companies do it. I know a lot of vehicular companies do the first sale rule, and that's something to just make sure that whatever you're using to try to mitigate your duty obligations, that you're using it correctly. And then lastly, evasion of import duties. This is bad. So $550,000 in penalties for evading. Basically, this is about Section 301, which was the Trump era tariffs that were added. And so that is, you know, something that can be very, very much a headache and very expensive, in that, you know, you're trying to say, okay, well, were the goods really made in China? Was it 51% from China? You know, and you have to evaluate the products to make sure that those goods aren't Section 301, and trying to evade it when they are really is costly. And so that's something that you've got to work with your broker, make sure that you understand the rules. You know, the HTS is thousands of pages long, and there are all these section rules and things like that that may or may not apply to your product. And then there's certain rules that we as brokers have to follow. So for example, if your good could be either in Chapter 39 or Chapter 56, and both of them are equally applicable, we have to use Chapter 56. I mean, we just have to. So that's something to be aware of, is that your broker is not trying to cost you more money. They're trying to keep you in compliance with the United States. Otherwise, you end up getting penalized way more than what you would pay in duties. And you will get caught. Just just understand you will, because they review this every year. So at the end of about 314 days is when you get liquidated. So they look at your product, they say, okay, yes, this makes sense, or no, it doesn't. And if it doesn't make sense, they go and they send you these awesome forms, Form 28, Form 29, and say, hey, can you explain this a little bit better? And then don't ever do that by yourself. Get an attorney or get a broker to help you through that. Usually an attorney is better, and they're worth the money. Trust me, they will keep you out of so many problems. All right. Proving the supply chain is trade compliant. So it really comes down to, as I was saying, due diligence. You've really got to make sure you've got a supplier code of conduct forbidding non-compliance. This doesn't really mean that you won't have forced labor in your supply chain somewhere, but it shows that you're doing your due diligence. Make sure your employees are trained and that they understand exactly what the cost of not doing it right, or trying to do it the easy way, or just, rubber stamping it, for lack of a better phrase, actually means to your company and even to their job. Monitor your compliance. A lot of big companies have full compliance departments. Smaller companies can't really afford that. Really small companies cannot afford that. So go to the people who know, talk to people like me, talk to your local community, find out who's in your ASCM chapter or forum, and ask them, hey, who do you know that's in compliance? And maybe we can work with them. And trust me, you might say, oh my God, I'm not paying that much money an hour. It's worth it. Just, to make sure that you're compliant, you'll sleep better at night. And if anything does come down the pike that's going to hurt you later, you have these tools in place that will make sure that you mitigate any of those problems later. Supply chain tracing information. So it really comes down to, there's some evidence that can be used, and this is something that customs looking for. So that they want to see really is that the purchase orders that you have, the invoices that you have, the packing list, all these things that you are supposed to have with your suppliers. Now, we know that it's unlikely you're going to get your sub-suppliers list, but you can talk to your suppliers and say, hey, you don't have to send it to me, but there's this guy at customs who's demanding it, and I need you to send it to them. And usually they'll be pretty compliant with that, because they want to keep your business. So say, you know what, I understand it's proprietary. Joe over at customs needs you to send it. It's joe.doe at cbp.gov, right? So that's one thing that you'll want to be able to talk to them about and say, it doesn't have to come to my company. We're not going to try to evade you. We just need to make sure that we can answer these questions to customs. If you're a minor producer or manufacturer and you're bringing in raw materials, it's the same thing. You need to be able to have any tracing documents that you have, evidence of any volume that inputs matches your outputs, and then other evidence such as pay stubs for employees and proof that they have the ability to leave the job are also very important for those suppliers and sub-suppliers. Information on supply chain management measures. So definitely want to mitigate as much as you can. You have, you got to remediate your suppliers if they are not compliant. So if they have non-compliant histories, you have to explain to them, look, I don't care who you do business with, but when you're doing business with me, you have to prove to me that you're not non-compliant with our laws. Demonstration of documentation, showing compliance measures are taken in your KPIs that can prove compliance. Put together that spreadsheet and say, okay, what did we do? What did we do? What do we know? That's the things I always ask myself. What do I know? What do I not know? And what did I do to find out? And if you could put that into a spreadsheet, or you could put that into some, a working book or a continuity book, and say, hey, we know that, XYZ supplier in Shenzhen, China is, working with, ABC supplier, but they're out of Qingdao, not Xinjiang. Or there is one out of Xinjiang, but none of the products from the Xinjiang region are coming into our products at all. And so if you can prove that, then you're already leaps and bounds ahead of where other people are, maybe not. And so they're not going to focus as much on you if you can prove to them that you haven't violated the UFLPA. So non-forced labors. We talked a lot about forced labor because that is the topic du jour. Section 301, as I said it earlier, those are trade compliance issues that you've got to make sure that you understand. Yeah, 25% is a bite and that hurts, especially if you're a small company and having to pay an extra, few thousand, tens of thousands. I have one client who pays $75,000 a month in duties because of Section 301 on something that's, usually been 2%. So, that's something that can be really, really problematic, but evading it costs so much more. Ways that you can avoid Section 301 is really, if you can, move your supply chain, where you're moving it to Vietnam instead, or you're moving it to the Philippines. I've had clients who have done that. Try to avoid Hong Kong, mainly because Hong Kong doesn't have a huge manufacturing industry. They have a lot of financial and they have a lot of import-export companies, but the manufacturing the United States knows happens in China. Not to mention, since the Hong Kong Chinese thing, every time that I see a shipment that comes in from Hong Kong, I actually had to put country of origin as China because the whole Hong Kong China conflict thing that happened. So that's something to know about. So definitely you want to look at other countries altogether. Like I said earlier, sanction and embargo countries, make sure you're not doing business with them unless you have an exemption. There are humanitarian exemptions that, I'm sure some companies are able to use. So that's something to know about. And then also you have anti-dumping and countervailing. So you want to make sure that that your product is being looked at all the time. Like you don't want to just do an audit once a year on your products because things are changing so quickly. You probably want your products to be reviewed every 3 to 6 months. And depending on your volume, that could be unreasonable. But you can also put in finding information or put in a Google alert for your products, that may have anti-dumping to them. And then you'll at least get the Federal Register that's looking to add an anti-dumping case to that particular product. So that can be very helpful for your trade compliance and making sure that you're not going to end up costing yourself, hundreds of percentages points against your product. So because there's some that I've seen have been 350% for the anti-dumping or even countervailing. And then also make sure that you can prove beyond a reasonable doubt to everyone that you have traced your supply chain, that you have taken reasonable care, and that you have all the proper documentation. And this is the biggest screen to really understand, is that everything has to be reasonably proven with the authorities should they come knocking. All right, so that's a lot of the cargo stuff, and I'm sure that that's what most people are concerned about, but there's other stuff too. And so this is something that you should be aware of. CFIUS, for example, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, makes it to where undue pressure on a U.S. company when you're taking foreign investment can cause a lot of problems. I remember a few years ago, I read about a company that was supplying to Boeing, and that company was taking undue pressure from their investors who happen to be from China. So this is something to really understand when it comes to your investment team, and to ask them, hey, you know what? We still have to be in compliance. We have to make sure that we're not going to have any other problems with the government on this undue pressure on our company. And so if you're talking to your team and you're saying, hey, what kind of stipulations are we looking at? Make sure that you understand what this law says, or this executive order that says you can't have an investor who's going to be giving this undue pressure on you. And then the United States Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So that's another one to be very aware of. This was established in 1977, and it says, nope, you can't bribe foreign officials to take your products. So even though that's the way it's done there, and I've heard this story a lot, oh, well, that's the way it's done. It doesn't matter. If you are found to have been bribing foreign officials, or pretty much anybody in a foreign country, to take your product, you can get in a lot of trouble. The DOJ and the SEC have a tendency to really scrutinize that because it makes the playing field unlevel, right? And you know, there's a lot of capitalism here, and we're all trying to just make a buck. But when it comes to unfair advantages, that's something that the government really looks at and says, no, you know what, you can't do that. You can't go grease on palms to get them to accept your products. So it's very important that you understand that, you know, you've got some restrictions, and you've got some people who are going to be very unhappy with you if you try to do something that is shady in any respect. So make sure that you understand both of these rules and keep yourself out of trouble. So here are the references. I will be sending this over to Brian and to Amanda so they can send this out to anyone who is interested. These are the links that you're going to want in the places that you're going to want to look. But like I said, Google can be your friend. I tell my clients all the time, look, I just Google better than the next guy because everything changes, and it changes so often and so quickly. So if you ever want to look this up or you want to find out more about it, you're welcome to give me a call. Send me an email actually, and let me know that, you know, how I can help. I am here for you. And actually I talked a lot faster than I expected to. So we got lots of time for questions and answers.
Yeah, hi Kim. I guess I'll start it off here. I noticed that there was a lot of potential costly mistakes on there. Are there any unique stories of people you've interacted with where you tried to save them, where people thought they had their ducks in a row and something unexpected happened? You know, like for omitting that paperwork trail in a timely fashion, or whatever. Is there anything that sticks out in your mind that maybe we can learn from?
Yes. Yeah, actually there's a few clients I've had in the past who have been unaware as to things that they needed to do in order to make sure that they're not going to get denied later. So tobacco industry is a really good one. There's a lot of places to get tripped up in tobacco, right? So, you know, whenever, so I deal with the teeny tiny businesses. So these are companies that are very, very small. They're usually just getting started. They require a lot of hand holding. So for one of them, you know, it really came down to making sure that they read the paperwork, and then they knew that they couldn't distribute their product until after they got the all clear. So that was a really fun one, trying to recover product that had already been distributed because they didn't read through the paperwork and see that they hadn't gotten the all clear from one of the PGAs. And so there's a partner government agency. And so they had to go and they had to basically call all their buyers and say, send it back, we need it, so we can satisfy the FDA's you know, look and everything like that. So that was one that was a really it wasn't as bad as a compliance issue. It was just more of a making sure that you know what you're doing once your product is ready. And actually with a different client, it just sort of happened again. They did get the clearance. They did not have the all clear from the PGA, but they got it later. But then Customs went back and said, yeah, we're going to suspend this release after they had already picked it up and we're trying to distribute it. And so like, you got to take it back. Like, you cannot send this out to where it's going. You have to, you know, you have to bring it back to Customs because they haven't released it yet. And she's like, but you said it was, I'm like, well, they unreleased it. I always tell people, I'm like, give it like a good 24 to 48 hours, especially if I'm here on a weekend and I'm clearing for you on a weekend. You know, you can pick it up on Monday, but don't send it out until Tuesday. Like, give Customs a minute to look at it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, and for me, doing imports, you know, supporting my division the way I do, you know, I have a hard enough time trying to keep up multiple shipments and reducing potential demurrage charges, you know, or time spent at port. So it's particularly enlightening to make sure I do my due diligence for the whole chain,
Mhm.
for everything that either gets combined or completely manufactured overseas. So
Right.
I found your presentation really useful.
Thank you. And you said you work with food, right?
Well, irrigation systems and
Okay.
components. Yeah, so
Okay, yeah, so
so looking
that's
at the
fun.
PVC comment
Mm.
that you made, gonna ask some questions with some other buyers and whatnot. Make sure everyone knows and make sure our ducks are
Yeah,
in a row.
the way that customs goes about it is they want to go through and say, okay, so they'll go through one industry that's been called out, and then they'll go through another one, and now PVC's been called out, so that's the next one they're going to go through. And eventually, it'll take years, but eventually they'll get through every single one and say, hey, you know what, your product happens to fall into this tariff code. We're going to look at it, and then you've got to make sure you've got all those ducks in a row, and you can just hand them a pamphlet or a paperwork or a book of stuff and say, here, we've done everything we're supposed to, please tell us where we went wrong. And remember, it's at the mercy of the king. Even though we have a king here. Were there any other questions?
I was about to encourage the group. I don't see any questions in the chat. None have been messaged to me directly, but do we have any souls willing to jump in the fray? Oh, there we go. Oregon president. Thank you for showing up, Oregon. Represent. I saw someone comment earlier. Has the USMCA made trade compliance easier?
Ah. It's made trade, like going back and forth, easier. The compliance aspects, though, not really. There's been some harsh stipulations that U.S. Customs has put on products, especially products in Mexico, when goods come over. So they've stipulated a higher input from the Mexico side. So like if you bring in, parts and pieces from China and you're assembling them in Mexico, but you don't have, I want to say 65%. And let me just tell you, in this industry, we don't memorize anything. So I'm guessing at 65% of Mexican derived goods, then it won't qualify for being from Mexico, even though in the United States, if it's 51% of US goods, it would qualify as being from the US. So yeah, it definitely got more complicated and a lot more to read.
Okay, we have another one. Curious about lithium ion batteries. Any specific notes or stories, since a lot of that is sourced from China?
Lithium ion batteries. I mean, gosh, not since it was allowed to fly again. I mean, when it wasn't allowed to fly, that was a real pain. But right now, I mean, really, there's not a big worry about them so much. I think there might be some anti-dumping. I'd have to look that up. But lithium ion is one of those things that's actually moving. That industry is moving here to Nevada, because we have lithium mines up in the north. And so a lot of that industry is starting to move this direction. But the ones coming from China, again, as long as you know where that lithium mine is and it's not in the Xinjiang region, you're doing really well. If you don't know, then I suggest you find out.
Yeah, it sounds very, very important to make sure that region is called out or looked into. I hope that
Yeah,
answers your question,
on that,
BM McCullough.
it's on that. It's, one of the things that really put that region in the hot spot was President Xi Jinping said specifically that Xinjiang is the hub of the Belt and Road Initiative. And the United States has been pushing against the Belt and Road Initiative for the better part of 10 years now. And that is the Made in China 2025 initiative that China came up with in, I want to say 15. And so when he said that, that really gave us a strategic reason to put UFLPA into place, in addition to the humanitarian reason. So, that's something to know, that we do act humanitarianly, of course, but there's got to be some strategy. So.
Right. I see another question from Anna Rose. Have you seen technological advancements that are meant to increase traceability, like IoT, being helpful in managing compliance?
So right now there's a bunch of companies, mine included, that are working on different solutions for being able to make sure that compliance is being monitored, right? So for example, my company is working on an infrastructure, other companies are working on bills of lading solely. It just depends on who you're talking to. There's actually a lot of companies that are starting to get involved in that space using AI and blockchain and IoT. There are some IoT devices that are being added to containers, but those are specific high dollar containers because those devices are not cheap. And we have what, like 13 million containers out there. So being able to, put these IoT devices that are 20 to 25 bucks a piece for one company to do it for their particular products, not so bad. For a container line to do it, that's not going to work because you're talking about a container line buying, a million at a time. So right now there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of people working on it and doing some R&D, but there's no actual viable products unless you're in food. Now for food, that's a really interesting industry that's really working hard on it. Dole, I think, was the first one to really start using blockchain with monitoring their refrigerated and climate controlled containers and making sure that everything that was moving in the environment supposed to. And so they've really kind of spearheaded a lot of that. So food is definitely one that's using a lot of it that I've been seeing. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes an answer is no one's willing to invest the money into the solution just yet. Who's first to market?
Yeah, there's some people in the market, they're all like kind of R&Ding it, but there's no like real yet. It'll come. You just have to wait.
No, I find it fascinating. I used to be in the flavor industry before I moved over to Toro. So, purchasing all the chemical reagents and all those sorts of things that are necessary to make that definitely presented its own challenges, or the juices for refrigerated and temperature controlled along the path for that definitely needed to assure some compliance in those specific instances. So yeah. I'm excited to see what that traceability improves with, and hopefully at a lower cost if things are nearshoring, right? Hopefully.
Yeah. Well, some of them are. And I think especially with food, I mean, you can find articles on Google, and I use Google a lot, but you can find a lot of articles in your search engine that says, traceability of your supply chain for food. And you'll find people who are working on, different products and different solutions specifically for that. And they could be simply software. It could be actual physical RFIDs. I know a guy who's actually working on an RFID widget that goes into pallets, so they know where the pallet's been. So there's a bunch of different stuff out there that people are working on. I think some of the biggest hiccups are battery life. So finding, like for example, if you wanted to try to put a device inside of a container has a 13-year lifespan. Batteries don't. And to have to, and you would want it in a container so that it can't be tampered with, right? And it has to have a Faraday cage so it can't, get knocked out by an EMP. And there's all these things that you think about in logistics that you're just like, oh, what's going to happen? And most people just get overwhelmed with all the logistics of it that they just give up. They're just like, no, it's not worth it yet.
That'd be a pretty big USB cable to recharge it for a container.
I can see it right now.
We do have a question from Lillian. How far you need to assure your vendors and their compliance? I guess layers deep. What would be a good?
Based on the law, all the way to raw goods. Based on the law, it's impractical. I get it, but based on the law, all the way to raw goods. But when it comes to what you can show customs is exactly what I showed you, is being able to show your purchase orders that you were not complicit. And that's really what you're trying to prove. I was not complicit in, non-compliance. And even if you're not allowed into the country, it's one of those things, at least you won't get fined. And so that's the thing, is that, to add insult to injury, if you are found to be complicit, which I think there was a recent article on sugarcane in the Dominican Republic, and they found that provider was actually using forced labor. And I believe the importer was complicit, or they found the importer to be complicit. So that's something to ask yourself, those layers of, hey, how complicit am I on this supply chain? What have I done to make sure that those particular suppliers are not complicit in their own supply chains? And all you can do is what you can do. What can you affect? Who can you reach out to? And then you have to empower your suppliers to reach out to their suppliers and explain to them that I'm your customer. I have to follow these laws, or I won't be your customer anymore because I'll be out of business.
Yeah, I remember those country of origin statements, or traceability, when I was purchasing food products specifically to make sure I was FDA compliant. I had to make sure that I had everything from the person I was purchasing from, and even though they don't want to share those sources, just like you said, sometimes it's difficult. So I definitely ran into that a couple times. I hope that answered your question, Lillian. Thank you for sharing. And oh, actually, she followed up. What else could we do to ensure compliance? Oh no, I think you answered that question.
I'm reading it here too. So she says, oh, because your companies source from Asia. So you're sourcing from American companies who then source from Asia. Certificate of origin, certificate of conformance. What else? What could we do to ensure compliance? And you work for a growing company. Oh, okay. First, hats off to you. Working for a growing company is very difficult. I would say really.
Have Kim's number on speed dial. Is that going to be the answer?
You got my email. I answer at times I probably shouldn't. I would say really it comes down to the legal nature of it. So I'm not an attorney. I have a master's in law. It really just helps me to interpret and explain to my clientele exactly what they're dealing with. But I do have plenty of attorney friends, and most of them say things like, everything in writing or it doesn't exist, right? So the big thing is to, make sure that those companies that you're working with, if you want them to purchase from or to avoid purchasing from China, then tell them that, say, hey, look, we understand that you have, that you've been sourcing from this particular area for some time and you have a great product. Is there any chance that you can source that product from somewhere else? Because it's becoming a very heated argument with China these days, not just on trade, but also politically. So, if we find ourselves in some sort of altercation at some point in the future, you're going to want to avoid that area anyway, right? So I would say if you're talking to the American companies you source from and they're sourcing from China, see if they can source from Vietnam instead. I mean, it doesn't hurt to ask the question. Just say, okay, if you can't source from Vietnam, what is your compliance strategy? What are you doing as the American company to make sure that your suppliers, when you supply me, are not violative? And that's really the biggest thing that you can do, and get all that in writing. Like, I have a contract that's very complicated and says, they are not going to source from anyone known to be using forced labor. They're not going to source from XUAR. They're not going to source from and just make these places, obviously nobody that's embargoed or sanctioned, and just put it in the contract. These are non grata and you cannot source from these areas, and that protects you. And then they have to comply with that, and then they force their compliance department or their compliance people to also do that. And if they refuse to follow up or refuse to do that, then maybe that's just not a supplier you need, and you can go find your stuff somewhere else.
Yeah, making sure your products aren't single sourced, is an endeavor I think most companies started undertaking during COVID, either by force or being proactive. Probably the former.
Or the cost of freight.
Yeah. So maybe that goes hand in hand with that. I don't see another question, but if someone still has time to think one up, I do want to comment that we do have other upcoming professional development webinars. There's one particularly that we've been discussing, and Amanda, if you could share the link at some point in the chat for the overview of a new ASCM supply chain sustainability course. It's a pretty exciting topic. It is something that touches all of us, and there seems to be a lot of steamrolling interest, from high level and more entry level people in general. And I guess we started this off talking about that weather and maybe what changes are related to that. One question has come in, and follow the link for those who are interested. Amanda just did share that, but Annette Weller also asked, how are recycled materials treated? Sustainability, there you go. Specifically items made from recycled cotton produced in China.
That is a very complicated question, because the logistician in me is thinking, okay, well, where did the cotton come from originally? Or are we talking about cotton that is like a cotton t-shirt, for example, that is then recycled in China and then it's coming here? So it's not necessarily the raw cotton that we have to worry about. It's where did the original cotton come from? And was that prior to UFLPA? Wow, that's a really hard question. Well, as a customs broker, I would tell you that if I were trying to import worn clothing, it's Chapter 63, and I would import it as worn clothing from China, right? If that worn clothing is coming from Shenzhen, for example, out of Yantian or something like that, then I would put, I would put all the information. One thing I forgot to mention, the biggest favor you can do for yourself is make sure any Chinese supplier gives you their zip code. As a customs broker, we are now required to input it when we file an entry. So get those zip codes from your suppliers if they're in China, and give them to your broker. I mean, you need to have that information, and you won't find it all the time on your invoices. Not every invoice carries the zip code or the postal code, and it's 6 digits, not 5. So now back to the question about recycled cotton material. It's not worn clothing, it's cotton made from recycled material. Oh gosh. Yeah, there is no way to trace that origin. You're right. I mean, there is. They have these. So based on people I've talked to at customs, they do have a test where they can actually take a wad of the fabric and they can find out where it was grown based on some chemical procedure. Don't ask me what it is. I'm not a scientist. But apparently they can put it through this lab test and they can figure out the geolocation, they can figure out the altitude. And I think all of this, it's kind of in Intel, right? So I come from a Air Force background, and I was in Intel, and you take all these different pieces of information, you put them together to try to figure out, okay, this came from this particular region. So they can trace it, but they have to have a reason. If your product is coming out of, Shenzhen or Xinjiang or Xiamen or Shanghai or somewhere like that, typically you're probably fine. It's a cotton item. If it's apparel, as long as it's not coming from Xinjiang itself, you're probably fine. They're going to handle it like normal apparel. If they do get something, a hair, and decide that, hey, you know what, I'm going to, this is recycled clothing, I don't know, I think maybe it did come from this area or the cotton did, they might decide on a withhold release order. I can't really tell you how that's going to go, but it's going to be complicated and it's going to take time. And that's one of the worst things you can do, is have it take a lot of time. And don't even think about trying to go through another port that's adjacent to China, because the country of origin is based on where it's created, not where it came out of. So that's something that we've been seeing a lot of people trying to work around. And that is actually, to answer your first question, Brian, that is one of the biggest stories of people trying to say its origin is Philippines, but it's not. It came from Manila, but its origin's not the Philippines. So that does happen quite a bit, is, So it really comes down to tracing the origin. If they get a wild hair and they say, hey, you know what, I want to go and I want to look at this because recycled clothing is weird, then they're going to, but they're going to either way. So all you can do is just make sure that you have your supply chain information as organized as possible, and then show them that, hey, it could, the worn or the recycled materials could have originated from the United States. I mean, they very well could have. And because we send a lot of recycling to China, a lot of plastic, a lot of wiring, all goes to China. And so it very well could have come from here too. I know that didn't really answer the question though.
Sometimes there is no best answer, right?
There's not an easy answer. That's an answer that'll take another 2 hours.
Well, we are at the 4 p.m. mark. I don't know if people are getting antsy or have more questions. Feel free to keep chiming in. I was going to comment on the exporting side. I believe you mentioned a lot of imports. Is there as much scrutiny, I guess, on exporting as there is on importing for the supply chain view?
Yeah, I mean, especially right now with the geopolitical nature that we have going on with Russia and Belarus, and people still have businesses that they have to run and operate, right? So there is a bit where we have to say, like the FLIR situation that I talked about earlier, and the BIS, fine of $2.7 million. Those kinds of things are things that are being heavily scrutinized. So we have to make sure that when you're trading with a partner that you get those end user statements. So it is, and then it comes down to the deemed exports I talked about earlier. So, if you've got a company that has a headquarters in China and they have a headquarters here, and their technology transfers are going from here to there, that's illegal. From there to here is fine, but from here to there is illegal. If they're on the entity list, not just because it's China, but because they're on the entity list. So that's, it gets really complicated, and there has to be like this full investigation that customs will go through if they feel like you are being violative. So if you have, there was one, oh gosh, I think it was a BIS FBI agent who told me about that. And he said that there was a professor who got 4 years at federal because he was teaching to non-cleared students, 2 non-cleared students. One was from Iran and the other one, I don't remember, China, I think. But he was being a professor. He was teaching them. I mean, that's his job. Well, they weren't cleared to receive that instruction, and it wasn't like top secret or anything. They just didn't have the country clearance for it, and he got 4 years at federal pen. So yeah, you could be just doing your job and not realizing you're being violative in this industry. So that's why we always say, stress on compliance. Make sure that you understand, and if you don't, get an attorney or get a broker. I mean, we talk all day long. That's what we do. All of us, we're all this way.
Yeah, I was wondering a little bit more. I felt like the imports would receive much more either dedicated resources for evaluations and scrutiny.
We can put a lot more resource. Again, you can control you, right? You can't control other people. You can't control other countries, but you can control you. So the United States has a tendency to control the United States. So they can control imports. When things go out of the country, all they can do later is come back with, with the delayed reaction of, oh, well, you violated, therefore we're going to fine you. They can't stop you, but they can make it very costly. And so that's really what comes down to is, or they can put you in prison if you're really violative. And so that's where it comes down to, you have to honor the code and say, okay, I'm going to learn as much as I can to not be violative with any of this, right? And just get as much information as you can, and always make sure that you're consulting with your legal representation.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if anyone else wants to chime in, but thank you again, Kim. At least for me, my head is spinning with what I could potentially be proactive in, and a lot of what I've been focusing on since I received my CLTD certification has been, on the network overall design, everything that's going on. But this specific, look at my products and trace them back a little bit further, definitely is something that I don't I don't know if anyone else has taken the interest in, especially to ensure, especially
Well,
for
ASCM
Chinese origin products.
headquarters, I believe ASCM headquarters is taking a very keen interest in traceability, in supply chain tracing, and in what customs brokers do specifically. I mean, we've been kind of the, necessary evil when it comes to shipment, trade, and supply chain. But now I've got some friends up at headquarters, and they have been saying that, we are looking at, potentially doing something that would be more in this vein, specifically because it is affecting people on the compliance level. And it is something that would be right in their wheelhouse. So I'm really hoping that they're able to get that moving very quickly. CLTD moved pretty quickly too. I remember I joined ASCM in like 14. I think it was only 3 years later that, when it was APICS, back when it was a different acronym. And I think it was only 3 years later that they got the CLTD certification started and started weaning out questions and what those questions mean. I was on a question committee, and we had a lot of, no, I understand it totally. And they're like, Kim, you understand that totally because you're a broker. Like, somebody's not a broker is not going to get this. And I'm like, it totally makes sense.
Yeah. Kim, the Oregon president from the ASCM Oregon chapter did want to make a comment. He exports product to Australia, and there are forms to fill out to make sure wooden pallets are treated, and they can have products treated to comply, I guess, is the comment he wanted to say, for ensuring that all the pallets that are heading out there meet those requirements. And
Yeah,
I'm not
I
sure,
always
but I
tell
think
people
Mexico has something similar, right?
Yeah, and actually we do too. Every country has it. So every country has a requirement for, because they don't want to find their ecology being screwed up by some bug that happens to live in that particular pallet, right? I try to recommend that people use as much as possible plastic pallets. They're much more sustainable. You can reuse them over and over again. They've got a pretty decent tensile strength now. They're not the cheap ones that, from decades past. And so if you can look at while it's a large upfront cost, you don't have to worry about treatments. You don't have to worry about fumigation, because we had to do that. When I worked in construction, we had to fumigate our containers because we used a lot of wooden pallets and crates. And so we just fumigate the whole thing. It was easier. But if you have apparel, you can't really, you don't really want to fumigate if you don't have to. So I recommend, if you can, rather than using wooden pallets, use plastic ones that are there, because you can reuse them. You can send them back and forth, and they can, that's much more sustainable than, and it is it's costly up front, but, and that's why I think you've got a lot of exchange pallets and stuff like that, because you do have companies that are using plastic. So I would say, if you can use a sustainable pallet, use that instead of wood. Wood is it's almost not worth the cost.
Noted. I definitely agree with that. There's another question that went through the chat. If you discover a shipment delay due to a compliance issue, who would you first contact beyond the supplier?
Oh, it depends on the issue. So if it was a withhold release order, if that's the question, like if it's a withhold release order, I would contact customs and try to find out what's going on. So my first, but I'm the broker, so contact your broker. Contact your broker first and say, hey, what's going, we just found out that and usually it's your broker that's going to tell you too. So it's either the broker or it's the terminal that's going to tell you that's not released. And so if your broker goes and looks at it and says, yeah, we're getting this error that we need to provide this paperwork, then, your broker's got a job to do and has to provide the paperwork. If it's still being held up after the paperwork's been done, you or your broker should contact customs and find out what's going on specifically. Typically what happens in my automated broker interface, which is the software that I use for customs, is I'll get an email from it saying your stuff has been held by customs. There's a CBP hold on it. You need to, you're not going to be able to pick it up, obviously. And now we've got a withhold release order. So now you have to cancel the entry. So the broker's notified to cancel the entry, which is just a pain. And then it has to be admitted into a foreign trade zone where it will sit until customs can get over there to actually look at it. And they're short staffed. So and the other biggest piece of advice I can give you is don't ever give them, don't give them attitude. Like they're short staffed too, and they have the authority of the US government to give you much more attitude. So play nice. Trust me, I've learned this one the hard way. Play nice. Make sure that they understand that you're just trying to get a job done and you understand that they're just trying to get a job done. So find out what happened. What do they need? What do you know? What do they need to know? What do they not know? And then provide all that information and also get direct contacts. If they give you a general mailbox, say, you know what, I'm happy to send it to that. But is there someone I can CC so I make sure someone looks at this because we needed this stuff yesterday? And usually if you've got a good rapport with that officer, they'll give you their personal mailbox. And then you can say, okay, great, officer, whoever, here's the stuff. And then you send it to the general one, but you've got this officer who's definitely taking a look at it. And so that's something that I recommend is, when you've got something being held up, play nice and provide as much information and be as cooperative as you possibly can, even if you have to kill them with kindness.
Well said. While you were saying that, I remembered one of the first times I imported an extract that had a certain composition of alcohol in it. And it didn't have sufficient documentation, when it was coming in. So it definitely got stuck and I don't know how many layers of
Bureaucracy
and customs problems. So I just kept calling until, like you said, found a person to talk to, and now I called that person and tried to make them my friend. So definitely
make them
agree
your
with
friend.
that advice.
And these folks, they get lonely and they need friends. And if you're their friend, you're gonna get a lot further than if you're not. If you're that person that calls them, they're like, oh God, not again. You don't want to be that person. Be that person's like, hey, how's the kids? Do you still have that dog? Get to know who they are and treat them as a human being. Because yes, they're just doing a job like the rest of us are, and they're just trying to get home to their kids at the end of the day.
Do you feel like we're omitting anything?
No, I mean, make friends with your CBP officer, provide zip codes for anything you import from China, and keep your paperwork as organized as you possibly can. If you can use use a folder, make sure that you know where everything is, make sure it's all encrypted, whatever you have to do, make sure that you can, you back it up on something in your office. I have a 4 terabyte hard drive in my desk, those kinds of things. Don't lose your paperwork. But yeah, I would say that the biggest favor you can do for yourself in trade compliance, especially now, is be as organized as possible, as friendly as you can with anybody that you're talking to, and that you have all the information, especially those postal codes, for imports coming in.
Proper documentation, well organized, proactive in all of those potential bottlenecks that could happen. So thank you, Kim. That's well said. I'm sure everyone here is thanking us and in the chat, and also letting us know they enjoyed it. So appreciate you and thank you for the presentation. As a reminder, we put this on from as a collective from the West Coast Collective. I'm Brian Favela from the ASCM San Diego chapter, and we hope that you'll join us on a future one. So have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you being here.